Hi there, my name is Professor John Ewing. Hi there, my name is Professor John Ewing, and I'd like to welcome you to our learning community on music and religion, or music and spirituality. And the first PowerPoint that I've made available in the PowerPoints area, if you log in under your English section, ENGL, and then whatever the class prefix is, 13. It's either 1301, 1302, or the 2000 level course, the American Lit section. And then you're enrolled in my Intro to World Religions, which is going to be the same prefix, PHIL, short for philosophy, 1304, Intro to World Religion. I want to take a few minutes and in this explanatory video go over the slides and the music links in the PowerPoint that's available now to you. Music, poetry, and religious expression. From time to time I'll be taking a sip of water here. I hope you're doing well. We are usually in the classroom at this point, Professor Matter and myself, and again, my name's John Ewing, first name John, last name Ewing. You can call me Professor or just Professor Ewing's fine. And we're glad you're in this class, although we're in, currently this fall semester, we're in a totally online format. So let me take a few minutes here, and if you open your PowerPoint, it's called Music, Poetry, and Religious Expression. You can listen to my voice in the background, listen to my narration, and just go through the slides here, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the images and some of the links in this PowerPoint that you can open up on YouTube. And I will try to keep this as brief as possible. The first slide, you see the title, obviously, and then you're going to see a couple of black and white photos from quite a while ago. On the left, you'll see George Harrison, one of the Fab Four, one of the Beatles, and probably this is always a tough judgment to make, but I think the consensus is that he was the real spiritual seeker in the group. Not that the others weren't seekers on and off, but George Harrison was someone who really took, when we talk about music and spirituality, he's sort of a poster child. He took both of these things very seriously. So in a sense, he's a great way to sort of open our class. And one thing I'll talk about, especially as we move along in the semester with this theme, is that religion itself has a musicality. It has a musical side. Sometimes with the accompaniment of instruments, sometimes not, just unaided human chant or prayer, as it's sometimes defined. And we will see that many of the revealed texts or sacred texts in these major world religions are themselves arranged and laid out very poetically, very musically, in the sense that, and we'll talk about the different senses of why religious expression uses music. And there are quite a few different dimensions and different levels. Pardon me, but every religion has its unique musical nature, musicality, as an aid to its spiritual side or its spiritual practice. Okay, on the left you obviously have George Harrison sometimes called the third Beatle, who lived in the shadow of John Lennon and Paul McCartney. In fact, Professor Matter tells a story about Frank Sinatra, the famous singer, Italian-American singer. And one time he was singing a song that had been written and performed by George Harrison of the Beatles. And he said, after he did his cover version of this, he said that he considered Lennon and McCartney to be geniuses or something such like that. In other words, not knowing that George Harrison was the one who had composed the song and performed the song predominantly. And George, in a sense, lived in the creative shadow of those two giants because typically on a Beatles album, and there were many, as you know, if you're familiar with the work of the Beatles, Lennon and McCartney would do the majority of the songwriting and singing, and they would usually let George have a song or possibly two, but usually a song. So in a sense, you hear a lot about Yoko Ono breaking up the Beatles, and there was obviously that in the mix. You hear a lot about Paul McCartney, and these guys had egos, etc., that were sort of not able to fit in the same room at a certain point in the late 60s. But George Harrison, I would say, is definitely a part of that, in the sense that he felt a little bit stifled, if I can say that, always having to live in the shadow of Lennon and McCartney. So George Harrison, brilliant musician. But one of the reasons that I'm choosing to take a look at George in this PowerPoint, at least to sort of get this going, is George was also fascinated by Eastern spirituality, particularly Indian spirituality, the subcontinent, South Asia as it's sometimes referred to, inclusive also of Pakistan and Bangladesh on the western and the eastern borders of the modern country of India, respectively. But Indian music as a whole, traditionally, as it's used in the various Indian religions, predominantly in the Hindu traditions. And George met Ravi Shankar, who was a famous classically trained Indian musician coming out of the Hindu tradition, famous sitar player. And Ravi Shankar was touring with his group through London in 1966, in the mid-60s. And George went off to, he'd already worked with some other South Indian musicians in London who were living in London at the time. But he went off to see Ravi perform with his touring group from India. And he was enamored with not only the musical style and the devotionality of it, if I can use that term, but specifically with Ravi and with his ability and his mastery of this ancient Indian instrument, sitar. Just a note about the term sitar. It's interestingly enough a Persian term. The ancient Persian language and the ancient Indian language, Sanskrit, are related. They come from the same family. But in Central Asia and in northern India, under the Mughals, there was sort of a fluorescence of Central Asian styles, or what we might call Persian instruments and music, blended with the traditional chanting styles, etc., of what was going on in India. And so tar, the word tar, simply means a stringed instrument, and se is the Farsi term or the Persian term for three. And so probably going well back, a setar just means literally a three-stringed instrument. Now, the modern sitar, you'll notice, has many more than three strings. But it's not, it's maybe a distant cousin from the guitar, right? Which, if you go back through the flamenco styles in Spain, etc., the guitar, right? The root of the word guitar, guitarra, right? In the Spanish language is, again, it means a stringed instrument. And so we don't have time here to talk about the history of these various stringed instruments, but just understand that a sitar or setar is simply a three-stringed instrument, and that was expanded in the period under the Mughal dynasty in India. So George goes off and witnesses this performance, and he meets Ravi, and you may or may not know that they developed a close friendship throughout their lives until George died. In fact, Ravi, with his daughter Anushka, who's also an accomplished sitarist, played it at his memorial, along with some Western musicians like Eric Clapton, who was a close friend of George Harrison. So Ravi Shankar outlived George and died at the ripe age of 92, I think. Not so long ago. Another incidental before we move on is not a lot of people know, and I didn't know. I was really into Norah Jones in the early 2000s when she swept the Grammys. I think it was 2002 that she exploded on the scene, and a lot of people knew that she had gone to UNT in Denton as a famous dropout, right? And then went off and became famous much later. But Norah Jones's biological father is Ravi Shankar, and that's really an amazing, astounding fact if you think about her life. She was estranged from him for a while, and then I think later they came to some reconciliation as she grew up. But very musically talented person, singer, songwriter, etc. More in the field of blues, etc. But Ravi Shankar is her biological father. So if you're a Norah Jones fan, it'll help you to appreciate her more, I think, if you realize the not just the biological link, but the musical link between Norah and her father. She has an Indian name. I'm drawing a blank, but you'd have to look her up on Wikipedia, and you can get her full name. It's not just Norah Jones. But anyway, so very interesting. Ravi Shankar has other children. His most famous daughter is currently tours the world. Her name is Anushka, and she also has continued her father's tradition of combining traditional Indian styles with Western styles. So you can go on YouTube and punch in Anushka Shankar, same surname, and you can hear her just doing solo. And you can also see that she's done some concerts in places like France and Spain, where there are classical musicians of a Western style, along with the Indian style and the Indian instruments. Very interesting. So this was a flourishing relationship. Eventually, George did go and sit at the feet, so to speak, of Ravi, and was trained in playing the sitar. And that's that first link. You can go on there and you can see a short excerpt where I think it was in the early 70s, George begins his lessons, or at least they have a film version of a lesson where he's learning the sitar with Ravi. Ravi was ambivalent to the blending of classical Indian music with what was termed rock and roll. And he was the first concert he played. He's most famously known in the West, or at least in the United States, for performing at Woodstock. And you can see a picture of Ravi with his troupe backstage, August 1969 here, and he's having a conversation with the famous folk singer, Joan Baez. She's 6 months pregnant when she performed at Woodstock here in this picture. And they're having a conversation backstage, which I think is kind of cool because I'm a big fan of Joan Baez. Just with my wife, just saw her perform. It was last year on Western Good Friday. She performed in the open air downtown Dallas, and my wife and I went. And she's an older lady now. She's been around. I mean, she was an acquaintance with Dr. Martin Luther King, and went on many marches with him, and was performing as a younger person at that time in the mid 60s. Later she was dating. She was a confidant of Bob Dylan, who was also involved in the folk music scene, and so she was invited to play at Woodstock. So you can touch on that link, and you can see maybe about 4 minutes of Ravi Shankar performing with South Asian instruments and performers on stage at the rock concert Woodstock, August 1969. And you'll get a little bit of a flavor. This blew people's minds at Woodstock, but this was not the first public appearance in the United States, at least on a large scale. Ravi was also, and his troupe also, was asked to perform 2 years previous at what's called Monterey Pop. The Monterey Pop Festival was organized by a guy that was in a group called the Mamas and the Papas. And it was a West Coast thing. If you think of Woodstock, you're thinking of New York, right? Upstate New York, and 500,000 young people out in the fields at this rock concert. Well, Monterey Pop was in June of 1967 in California, where I'm from. I'm not from Monterey, but Monterey Pop Festival was the first large-scale public appearance of Janis Joplin. If you know her, she's originally from Texas. Unfortunately, she died rather young. Jimi Hendrix, it was his first major appearance. Jimi Hendrix and the Experience, his band. It's also infamously, and you probably have seen a clip of this, where at the end of his performance, Jimi sort of iconoclastically poured lighter fluid all over his guitar and lit it on fire. Very interesting. But Jimi Hendrix, there were many other groups that played at Monterey Pop, and Ravi Shankar performed there, and it was really his first large-scale event that he was asked to participate in June of 1967. So that's well before Woodstock. But Woodstock obviously put him on the map as far as American kids and the counterculture, etc. And later, I think he warmed up to the idea of exposing Western people, especially youth, to classical Indian music. He took it very seriously. He had been trained, obviously, and the people that he was with sometimes had misgivings about even performing in Western countries. So that was something that he did struggle with. But he had a lifelong friendship with George, And George is quoted as saying that when he met Ravi, that was the first person in his life who really, really deeply impressed him. He just had a gravitas, a spiritual centeredness that I think George was looking for when he was a young man. Anyway, and they continued that relationship. And so you can touch on those links and check that out. Now, if we go to our second slide here, I want to talk a little bit more about music on the different levels when we talk about the world religions. The first one here, obviously, this is a contemporary image of a Hindu deity, the goddess Saraswati. And she's, even though it looks like a sitar, she's playing something else called a veena, the instrument that's associated with her. Saraswati is the patroness in contemporary Hinduism of wisdom and therefore learning and also music, because music entails discipline and spiritual discipline and therefore wisdom. And I put a term up here called sadhana. The accent's on the front end of the term. Sometimes people say sadhana, which that's okay, but it's pronounced sadhana. And this is a hard word to translate, but it's kind of like being in the zone. It doesn't come automatically. It's a means of accomplishing a spiritual goal. And it can be done through meditation, where you lose your sense of kind of the small I, right? Your ego. So it's an ego transcending practice. It can be anything, in a sense, that enables this, the leaving of the ego behind and getting closer to God, in a sense, or the divine. So music, learning an instrument, mastering an instrument, learning the scales, through that self-discipline, you can lose yourself, you can transcend your ego, and you can ultimately attain to something called dispassion, right? Where you're not led by your emotions, and also this practice of non-attachment. You can hear about non-attachment in Jainism, which is another ancient Indian religion, also in Buddhism, the concept of non-attachment, right? Not grasping onto things or other people, etc., for your sense of self. So music, therefore, is a pathway to union with the divine. And I've listed one of the paths in traditional Hindu practices referred to as bhakti. Bhakti can be translated as love, but it can also be translated as devotion. And marga or magga is the pathway. So in Hinduism, traditionally there are many spiritual paths to union with the divine. Karma marga is the path of selfless action and selfless works. If you think of Mother Teresa, she would be a good example of that. If you think of Jnana marga, right, the path of wisdom or knowledge, the scholar's path. The scholar finds God or the divine through really deeply thinking about sacred texts and philosophical texts and meditating on their meaning. But Bhakti Marga is the path of love or the path of devotion, and hence music can be a part of that through discipline, self-discipline, and through practice. If you touch on the link I have here, you will see a traditionally trained Indian musician at a festival in London called the Darbar Festival. Lots of nice music comes out of that festival on YouTube. But a few minutes, if you just listen to him playing what's referred to as the Saraswati, after the goddess, right? The Veena. And it's a very devotional, the tempo will change, but you can see he's very meditative, very prayerful in this. Okay, if we go to the next slide, you will see a couple of images here. This is the first surah or chapter of the Quran, which is the Holy Scripture in the religion of Islam. Also has a very musical quality to it, and many times when it's recited, it's chanted or sung. In fact, some people think that in the tradition of Islam, when the Archangel Gabriel comes to Muhammad and commands him to recite or read in the name of your Lord, right, that he begins to sing in a sense, or chant. Recite can also be interpreted as like a recitation of something, or not just a quiet reading, but although it can be interpreted that way as well. In other words, to chant out loud, to sing out loud. So this is in Arabic. The Al-Fatiha is the opening, the first surah or first chapter of the Quran. It has 7 verses, and many Muslims try to recite and memorize the entire Quran, and they become a hafiz, one who can recite the entire Quran by memory, all 114 chapters. It's quite lengthy. And there are competitions for this, right? Where children recite the entire Quran from memory. But all Muslims, I would say, would commit at least Al-Fatiha and some other favorite surahs to memory, and they would recite this prayerfully each day. Al-Fatiha has 7 verses. I don't know them in the Arabic original. If you look at the one on the left here, the image is Al-Fatiha written on a camel bone. And this is from very early on. The surahs were sometimes written down. Paper was a very prized possession, and so some of the early surahs were written down on leather skin. And here you have an example of a camel bone with these opening verses written by a scribe directly on the bone. If you touch on the link here, you'll have the Adhan, or Azan as it's pronounced in the Persian pronunciation, the call to prayer. The video I have attached to this link is about 4 minutes long. You get the flavor of it, but the visuals on this are from the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, where the Dome of the Rock is, and also the Al-Aqsa Mosque, 2 different Muslim edifices on that high place in Jerusalem, where it used to be the Jewish temple stood at the time of Jesus, and the Romans destroyed that in 70 CE. Later, the Muslims conquered the holy city of Jerusalem in the 600s on the Western dating under Caliph Omar, one of the successors after Muhammad had died, and eventually then under one of the Damascus caliphs in the 690s CE. An edifice was built on the Temple Mount called the Dome of the Rock in Arabic, because there's literally a dome over the rock, where by tradition, in Jewish tradition, it's Mount Moriah. It's where Abraham attempts to sacrifice his son Isaac in the book of Genesis 22. In Muslim tradition, it's also significant in the Mi'raj, the ascent, the night journey of the Prophet Muhammad, where he's taken from Mecca to Jerusalem and stands on this rock. Of course, there's no dome at the time of Muhammad's journey. Whether you interpret that as a bodily ascension or an out-of-body experience, in early Islam it was debated by the scholars whether his ascent was a bodily one or whether it was what we might call an out-of-body experience. Generally, most Muslims understand it to be a bodily ascension now, but in early Islam that was something that was debated. as far as his mystical vision of paradise, etc. So if you touch on this link, you're going to hear a call to prayer. You won't hear this Fatiha Surah chanted, but simply a call to prayer being chanted, calling the people to come and pray, come to success. There is no God but Allah, the one God, and Muhammad is the one that he sent, right? Muhammad is his Rasul, his apostle, or his messenger. So you can listen to that being chanted in Arabic. Music, therefore, becomes a help, an aid to memorization, right? Kids do this with the ABC song, right? If they try to simply memorize things, it becomes very difficult. But if they can use a song or use musicality, if they can chant, then this is something we call a mnemonic device. Not a demonic device, but mnemonic, right? From the Greek word mnemi, meaning memory, right? So it's an aid to memorization in the case of chanting a sacred scripture such as the Quran. Okay, you go to the next slide, and now we're in Judaism, and this is a link to a Yemenite Jew, a cantor, reciting a portion of the Torah, right? The fifth book of the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible is the book of Deuteronomy. In English, it's the book of Deuteronomy. And especially the 4th verse from the 6th chapter, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, translates from the Hebrew, "Hear, O Israel," or "Listen, O Israel, Yahweh Elohim, the Lord our God, is one Lord." Notice the emphasis already. Moses is addressing the Israelites. The God of the Israelites, right, is one, as opposed to the many gods of the Egyptians, if you think about the ancient Egyptian religion. And the Israelites have come out of Egypt, and Moses is instructing them. He's saying, "Listen up, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord," as opposed to the many, right? So this is nice if you follow this link. This is a trilingual chanting, and these Jews originally were from the southern tip of what would now be the Arabian Peninsula, the modern country of Yemen, where there was quite a bit of warfare recently. But this was a Yemenite Jewish tradition of chant, a style of chant. Hebrew original, and then the Aramaic, which is a Near Eastern in the Semitic family of languages, and then an Arabic version. And this is really nice if you listen to this, because the cantor is chanting in 3 different Semitic languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic. So music here is used as a form of prayer, reciting. Okay, the next slide on the left gives you a nice picture of the inside of the Hagia Sophia, or the Saint Sophia. What used to be the greatest, was considered a wonder of the world, but the greatest cathedral in the history of Christendom, right? Christianity. An Eastern Christian church. So this is a sacred site for Eastern Orthodox Christians, or Greek Orthodox Christians as they're called sometimes. The Eastern Roman Empire never fell. Sometimes it's called Byzantium, although that was a later term. They referred to themselves simply as Romans, and they saw themselves as the continuation of the Roman Empire, which had collapsed in the West in around 500 CE. But the Byzantine Empire, as it's referred to, the Eastern Roman Empire, lasted for another 1,000 years until the Ottoman Turks took over Constantinople, the city of Constantine. And they converted this Christian cathedral, St. Sophia, named after the divine wisdom. They converted it into a mosque, and they used it as their place of worship. Interesting enough that they kept some of the imagery you can still visit here in Istanbul, Turkey. It was a museum for the last 100 years after Ataturk and the end of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I. For 100 years, this was a museum. And recently, under the current president of Turkey, Erdogan, it's just been converted back to use as a Muslim mosque for the first time in 100 years. And so this is a very sacred place, not only to Muslims, obviously, but to Eastern Christians, Eastern Orthodox Christians. And if you follow this link, this is an example of what's called Byzantine chant. It's in the Greek language, which is the language of the Christian portion of the Bible. The New Testament is predominantly in the Greek language. And much of the Eastern liturgy in what's referred to as the Greek Orthodox Church is still chanted in this very high Byzantine style. And this is an example of a chanter with his accompanying choir. And they're chanting a hymn commemorating the crucifixion of Jesus Christ that would be chanted only on one day in the year in the Greek Orthodox Church, and that would be on Holy Friday, remembering the sufferings of Christ on the cross there. So it's a very somber tune, but very uplifting. If you listen to this, it takes about 4 minutes. Music, therefore, is an expression of beauty. Not just the architecture, not just the iconography. The picture on the right here is another Greek Orthodox basilica style. You can see with the Byzantine cross and some of the icons in the background of Jesus, the Virgin Mary, etc. So we have all of these visual aids in the Eastern Christian traditions, and we have also the musical chant, which is meant to uplift the soul, even at times, very somber times, right? A funeral, etc., would still be somewhat comforting to chant these hymns and rely on the divine grace in that sense. So I'm going to go ahead and end my video there on music, poetry, and religious expression. Hope this was helpful, and have some fun with these musical links. They're all publicly available on YouTube. So take care of yourselves, and I'll go ahead and stop here.